And if you ignore my reasonable plea, that's just fine by me. Cause all the media scene, the cause and reason for leaks is more than freedom of speech. It's also people's belief that we all need to be briefed. In order to keep all the peace, we ought to police the police. And that takes much more than just a formal PR release. So all in all, you see, we speak what we seek, and we deceive what we speak. It's the truth that's keeping us free.
Hello, and welcome to the Tech Dirt Podcast. I'm Mike Masnick. I wanted to start off again by thanking people for all the feedback that they've shared recently, especially on potential new topics for discussion. There have been some really good ideas, and we're going to try to explore many of them. We've got a pretty big list of topics already, which is great, because when we started this, I was initially a little bit worried that we'd run out of topics to discuss after a dozen or so episodes. Thankfully, it looks like that's not happening just yet. From the outside, in fact, many people seem to think that being a media property, the biggest challenge that you face is how do you find enough content to write about or talk about or whatever. This is why PR people are constantly pitching stories, pretending that they're helping you find a story, or why people give a sarcastic slow news day comment on stories that they don't think are worth covering. The fact is that there are really no slow news days. There is always more stuff to cover. Instead, the real challenge for online media companies these days may be keeping the lights on. In early March, the popular tech news site GigaOM suddenly shut down with absolutely no warning whatsoever, taking almost everyone by surprise. In fact, I had done an interview with a GigaOM reporter just 2 hours before the site announced that it was shutting down and everyone was fired. More recently, a popular San Francisco news and culture site called The Bold Italic announced that it was shutting down as well. The site, which was owned by media giant Gannett, though that fact was kept pretty quiet, was well known in the San Francisco Bay Area for some really great and interesting stories, but now it's gone too. In the postmortems for GigaOM, it appeared that the ambitions of the site just didn't match up to the revenue. Many people blame the fact that the site had raised nearly $25 million from venture capital firms, but it's pretty rare for a VC-funded company to just flat out disappear like that. Usually they get sold off in some sort of fire sale, which everyone dresses up to look like a successful exit. Instead, in this case, it appears that it may be the many millions in debt that GigaOM took in addition to the venture capital. After all, the shutdown was precipitated by the inability to pay the interest on the debt and the creditors taking control over the assets. It's not quite clear what took down the Bold Italic at this point, but it seems likely that Gannett just couldn't justify the revenue for the cost, or rather, the cost for the revenue, whichever way that might go. Both of these highlight the basic truism about online media that the business model is extremely difficult. For all the talk we hear about musicians complaining about their revenue dropping off a cliff, if you look at the price paid for display advertising, it has decreased even more. Where you used to be able to see $40 or $50 per thousand view prices for advertising, people are now happy to get $1 or $2. It's been a real bloodbath in the ad market. Combine that with the new normal in traffic created by big mega sites like Buzzfeed, which now say that you need massive scale in traffic to even get into ad deals, suggests that we need a new way of thinking about media business models. There are certainly some small niche sites like Tech Dirt, obviously, and other ones like Ben Thompson's Stratechery. But is there a real business model for the middle ground of media sites today? Here to discuss that, again, the Tech Dirt podcast crew of Dennis Yang and Hirsch Reddy.
Hey, guys.
Hey. So, can media properties survive online?
I mean, I think that's a very good question. I mean, traditionally, the business model for media has always been advertising.
Yeah,
right?
For the most part.
I mean, right. So, I mean, there are always different angles with which to make money. I mean, like subscription is another angle, of course. And I know Tech Dirt, we've definitely explored other ways to keep it a viable business.
Yes.
Right.
And it's always been, it's always been a variety, and it's always been changing, right? But traditionally, the point that you're making is true. Traditionally, most media properties made money by one of two things, which was advertising, and that was the majority of it, or subscription. And it was a very small number that could actually survive based on subscription revenue. Oftentimes, the subscription revenue for paper-based publications really covered the cost of printing and maybe distribution, but not the rest of the actual.
And I think that, predominantly, when I was back at CNET, like the advertising business model as it applies to at least media sites, call it, look at back in kind of the late 90s, early 2000s, was very similar to the print publication advertising approach, which was aggregate a specific targeted audience and sell advertisers to the people that were looking at your paper book.
Right.
And I think this is just speculating on my part, but what online has actually enabled is the aggregation of the target audiences, irrespective of what people are actually looking at.
Right. And so, part of my argument has always been that the traditional news business, by which I generally mean, local newspapers, right? Sure. Which is the one that you think of most if you go back, 60, 70 years or something, that they always thought that they were in the news business, and the reality is that they were in the community business, right? And they would bring together a community, and they would basically be collecting that community's attention, and then they would be selling that attention to advertisers.
Right. And that's why classified ads were such a large part of...
That was everything, right? Yeah, the newspaper business was really the classified ads business. Yeah. And the internet broke that apart in a whole number of ways, in large part because, at that time, those newspapers were sort of the only community that you could build in that way. Whereas now with the internet, you can build all different kinds of communities, and not just around local, which is what the local newspapers were, but around particular interests, certainly, regional stuff, but also a whole, everything, right? There's communities for almost everything. And so it's much more fragmented, and you have these communities that don't necessarily need to be connected to news and journalism. Mm-hmm. And so, so almost everything about the equation that everyone was used to for funding media has changed.
Right. But I think, when you're buying advertising, you're typically saying something like, hey, I'm looking to reach, women from the age of 30 to 40 who live in an urban area. Right? Yeah. And traditionally, you would go to your magazine or newspaper publishers and be like, hey, what publications do you have that reach this audience? Mm-hmm. The equation has now changed where, with Facebook and Google, you're basically able to target that exact demographic without specifically targeting publications, meaning what that allows you to do is it allows really large, kind of broad spectrum interest sites like a Buzzfeed, mm-hmm. To be able to monetize their very specific targeted audiences. One of the things that we saw at CNET was I was there in the early 2000s. There was always basically a kind of a push and pull between the sites with very large untargeted audiences like download.com and GameSpot, mm-hmm. and very small specific audiences like a news.com. And it was always like, how do we monetize these sites with huge numbers of page views, but we don't have enough advertisers for those numbers of page views? And then news.com is like, how do we get more inventory? Because we have advertisers willing to pay $40, $50, $60 CPMs for this very awesome audience. And what kind of essentially online advertising has allowed you to do is to reach the scale, mm-hmm. of the audience and the targeting, right? But what that does is it kind of reduces the CPM. It increases the CPMs on your large media properties, but it decreases the CPMs,
right? And
on
for
your niche publications.
For people who don't know what CPM is, it's just the cost per 1,000 views,
right? So it's like the cost. Basically, call it your cost of advertising,
right?
And the higher, obviously, your CPMs, the more effective you can make money from it, especially if you're a smaller publication. So
right, and historically, there were certainly stories of very targeted, publications online that were able to command like $100 CPMs for advertisements, which is is an insane number for a variety of reasons. And today, I mean, you have nothing even remotely close to that.
Well, one of the complications I think is it's really the sort of the inventory question, right? So, as Dennis was saying, there used to be very small targeted sites for very small targeted exclusive audiences, and the problem is there was this assumption before. Well, not really an assumption, but it was kind of built into the structure of the market where this very highly educated, high salary sort of audience that I'm trying to reach. I can't find it on the lolcats videos or this other sort of lowbrow stuff because they're just diluted amongst the millions of other people. But now with all the intelligence that people are gathering on those viewers, like Dennis said, you can target that very high value audience on the lolcat videos. But the thing is, the lolcat videos cost nothing to make. And so if you're trying to get their eyeballs, you don't really care if those eyeballs came via an Economist article or whether they came from the lolcat videos. And so that's a problem. So here's the thing that I really think that like what news organizations need to do is almost change sort of the formula of how they do the advertising or the presentation such that the attention that people are paying when they're reading that high quality content is materially a different sort of attention, right? Like or brings a particular media property or a particular brand a different kind of a halo, right? Because like let's say you're trying to sell a BMW and the exact same guy, you can track him with these cookies and he can see the BMW ad on let's say video of a guy falling down on a skateboard, or he can see it on this study that The Economist is doing on, say, the European debt crisis or something like that, right? What The Economist really needs to do is be able to say that exact same eyeball for that exact same period of time is more valuable if the brand is presented on Economist. Because if they can't do that, then essentially, why would they? I mean, if the high quality eyeball is exactly the same monetizability on either one, then they can't win, right?
I think they are. You are able to command a higher CPM on a focused publication, just not nearly as high.
Yeah, it's
how do they justify
the pressure? The downward pressure on the pricing has gone down tremendously, and part of it is just, I mean, it's a supply and demand thing, right? I mean, the supply is huge, and you have much better targeting, and so you have all this
trackability,
sort of
right?
real time bidding, which basically gives it to the whoever will fill it at the cheapest, effectively.
Yeah, but if I'm BMW. Do you think materially, if I know for a fact that here's an individual uniquely tied to this device, right, and we know is a rich guy, he's in the market for BMW probably, you might even know that much. Do you care if the ad reaches him over YouTube or if it comes to him, on The Economist directly?
Yeah, you do care, and you will pay a premium for it, but not a very large premium, because you know that there's an association, there's a value with the association, and I think that's absolutely true. But it's the level of premium that you can get has seriously gone down. So let me take this conversation. We could spend the entire time of this podcast talking about the advertising business, but I actually don't think that's that interesting, frankly, right? Yeah. And so let's take this beyond that and start to think about what other business models are there for online media that get beyond advertising, because we've become so infatuated with this idea that everything has to be advertising based. And then the alternative being, you go back to the other alternative which they have, which is everyone says subscriptions, which, in the online world is paywalls. And I don't think that's a particularly good business model either. And in fact, we've seen, for the most part, paywalls have not survived. And in the few cases where they've done okay, they tend to be, what I like to refer to as the emperor's new paywall, right? And that there are always ways around it. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, you can always figure out a way around it, either by clearing your cookies or doing a Google search. Right. And so people are really sort of paying just for the convenience factor of not having to do that, or because they don't know any better.
Yeah, and if you look at the price of those paywalls, like New York Times is 99 cents now for
I don't even know.
a month. I mean, and essentially it's
that's just the introductory price.
Yeah, I mean, and every time I get around it, I'm starting to feel shamed. I'm like, really? Like, is this content not worth $1? But
do you really feel that?
I feel a little bit ashamed, right? So
I subscribe to The Economist, where I can easily get around it. In fact, I never actually sign in for my account to read stuff.
Yeah.
I just would go in incognito. It's just easier.
Yeah.
than sitting there and typing in fast.
Totally, but
So are there
the
other
fact is,
models?
right? But my argument is, so the paywall kind of maybe works for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Economist.
Right.
I don't think it's really the paywall, though. I think we just established that people. It's not really the paywall. It's the fact that people want to pay for the publication, right? Like,
Yep.
Yeah.
it's not. And so, what is that? I mean, that's more like
That's the-
patronage or something like
That's
that.
the NPR business model.
To some extent, right? But in a large way, I think certainly the New York Times one is very much the kind of NPR business model. So then let's take it a step away from that. And so the other one the one that people talk about today is certainly like crowdfunding, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so certainly TechDirt, right? I mean, last year we did the crowdfunding campaign through Beacon Reader, and we were able to actually raise about $70,000, which is pretty good for a crowdfunding campaign. I've seen a lot of other crowdfunding campaigns for media properties that don't really do as well, and sometimes you just have you have a chicken and egg problem. I mean, to get a big enough audience to actually support a crowdfunding campaign is pretty difficult. Especially if you're trying to support more than a single journalist. But even single journalist campaigns are pretty difficult. So, I mean, do we think, is there a business model in crowdfunding for journalism?
I think sort of the way we have to think about it is more granular, right?
Okay.
Like I think, for example, if someone went on, I think one of the reasons the Beacon Journal kind of crowdfunding thing that you were successful, the reason you were successful is that specifically the topic, right? Like,
yeah, sure.
You went after a specific topic. You said, we're going to cover this in the same way we cover the other stuff in that same kind of a...
Right. And for those of you who missed it, it was net neutrality. We said
Yeah.
we were going to cover the net neutrality fight for a year, and that's what the campaign was for.
And so I think if you do something along those lines, right, where people say like, you target a very specific thing and you say, I'm a journalist, I've got this track record, I'm going after this story.
Yeah.
Who wants to fund? I think that could be successful. I mean, I would pay for that, right? Like, even if
Did you contribute to our campaign?
Yeah, I did. And and I got you more people because I shared it on my
Excellent.
my
Thank you.
feed. But the thing is apart from that, like you happen to have a larger kind of a social circle than I think, or not social, I should say, a following,
Yeah,
an
sure.
online following than most journalists, and so it makes sense for there to be something like a Kickstarter, right? And I guess that's what the Beacon Reader
Yeah.
guys are trying to do, right? But the problem is, I don't know if most people know that site exists,
Yeah.
right? And it's just a question of that thing getting bigger, or them having their like what was the name of that podcast that just blew up this year and now all
Serial?
podcasts Serial having their Serial moment, right? Like some very gripping piece of journalism.
And they've tried, and those guys are really interesting. And actually, what we should do, we should invite them on the podcast. I'm sure they would love to come on the podcast and talk about it. And they're one thing that's really cool, and kind of because I worked really closely with them and have stayed in touch with them since then, is that
You're talking about the Beacon Reader?
the Beacon Reader guys, yes. They're not committed to just one model. I mean, they really see it as they want to build a system that will help fund journalism, and so they're really open to experimenting and doing different things. And they actually there was a controversy last year when they had done this project with right after our project, actually, with Huffington Post. They teamed up with Huffington Post over getting a reporter to cover Ferguson, because there were obviously all the protests in Ferguson and the Michael Brown shooting and all the coverage of that, and basically the national media parachuted in and we're covering it. And what Huffington Post and Beacon Reader and a few other people realized was that after 2 weeks or however long the sort of attention span of the nation was going to be on Ferguson, all those people were going to leave, and then who was going to cover the story really after that? And certainly there are some local reporters, but Huffington Post said we can't afford to have, every time there's a big story somewhere that we don't have, a bureau or a reporter stationed, we can't afford to just add a new reporter. So what if we team up with Beacon and crowdfund to get a reporter? And they found this woman who was either a current journalism school student or had recently graduated journalism school, was actually working in like retail at the time, couldn't find a journalism job. They found her, and they, raised a certain amount of money. I don't remember how much money they raised, but for her to then basically be a full-time reporter about what was happening in Ferguson for Huffington Post, which I thought was a really great experiment. But a lot of people got really angry at it because Huffington Post is a big site. It's owned by AOL, and AOL has a bunch of money, and they're like, well, why are you doing this? This is, and we've seen the same thing with crowdfunding and other things where like famous movie stars use Kickstarter, and people are like, oh no, Kickstarter is supposed to be for the nobodies. So you have this sort of weird balancing act.
I don't know how sympathetic I am to that kind of an outrage. It just doesn't make any
People
sense.
just get outraged for.
Well, the way they have to think about the value that Huffington Post brings there is the fact that if that woman who currently was not employed as a journalist was trying to get notice for doing Ferguson journalism, it would be very hard for her to kind of vet herself, and like Huffington Post does that, and kind of and for that reason,
and that was part of the deal, was that they were going to mentor her and they would give her professional editor and everything along those lines. And then, but just in thinking about other things, another site that I think has been really, really interesting, which is sort of a crowdfunding thing, but is different than what some people think of crowdfunding, is Patreon.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which, getting back to this whole idea of patronage, right? I mean, that's where the name comes from. Mm-hmm. And their whole idea is that you get people to sign up to agree to, for every time you produce content, that the system will automatically, take $1 from everybody who agreed to do that.
Right.
And that's been really interesting. And I've spoken to those guys for months since basically.
Has it been successful from a journalistic standpoint? Are there any journalism projects?
There are some on there, but they're really still trying to figure that out. I think it was designed originally for musicians mainly and filmmakers. Mm-hmm. And that's where it's been most successful, because those are the kinds of content where there's a lot of time in between each content release. Whereas unless you're doing like a big investigative report,
right?
It's tougher to. So like I had spoken to them really early on when they were just launching and trying to figure out like, well, could we test this with TechDirt? And we couldn't really come up with something that was unique enough, right? I mean, we could do something where it's like every month pay us money, but then it's just a regular crowdfunding thing. Like, it needed something that sort of matched more with that. There needs to be sort of a period of time between each thing that you release. And we didn't quite figure that out. And I don't know if they've quite figured out how to make that work for journalism.
I mean, in a sense, I don't know if this is true or not, but it's like, how do you balance the popular content with maybe, like, I don't know, I don't want to call it like more important or impactful or
sure.
What is the journalism, the Pulitzer winning journalism?
Yeah, and this is a big concern, right? Because everyone always jokes about Buzzfeed, and I think somewhat unfairly, right? Because Buzzfeed started out as just sort of lowest common denominator, clickbait kind of content. And so everyone
which they sourced from Reddit, by the way.
Well, in a lot of cases they did, right? And they've
Still.
sort of purged the site of a lot of that stuff. But since then they've gone on. They've now hired a really strong journalistic team that does real news and does some incredibly impressive investigative reporting, though.
Which sometimes still uses lessons that they took from
absolutely
their pop journalism, which is actually amusing to see.
And if you go back and people say like, oh, it's ridiculous that serious journalism would be, put alongside 29, smiling gifs of cats or something. I don't know, whatever they do.
Or those grabby headlines.
But if it gets
look
people
at what this president did next.
Yeah, but I mean, BuzzFeed was actually, they were never that bad about it. People assume it was them, but it was really other sites that did that. But then, you look at newspapers, and newspapers always had like comics and crossword puzzles and horoscopes and all that kind of junk also. And so, there's always been a mix in terms of media.
And where did that mix kind of come from? Was it the altruism of the news organizations saying that we're this newspaper and we have to put out these hard-hitting stories along with the comics? Well,
I mean, even then you start to look back at the history of news and journalism, and you recognize like this idea that journalism was this high-minded activity of speaking truth to power and investigating important things and documenting it. Like, that's a pretty modern invention.
Yeah.
I mean, early journalism was not like that at all.
Right. And it became a really good business, which is, when they were actually selling papers and the whole yellow journalism, Hearst days.
Sure.
Those were big businesses that were treading in very kind of
but that was
waters.
But it was interesting too, because part of that was the reason that worked was because their voices were powerful in terms of making a message that could influence the population. And that was because, you had a very limited media market at that point.
Right.
And the one thing you can't say about this media market is that it's limited, is basically unlimited, right? I think maybe to some extent, I mean, there's two things that are conflated, right? I mean, there's the editorial voice in journalism, right? Which, largely that's what TechDirt does, right? I mean, you guys don't go out and necessarily investigate.
Right, we're mostly an opinion site.
Exactly. Yeah. And there is the sort of the dogged pursuit of facts kind of thing, right?
Yep.
And the getting the story. And those two things, certainly the opinion doesn't exist unless there's facts being surfaced, and sometimes inconvenient facts. But the way that we source those facts, maybe that has to change a little bit, right? Well,
I think it already has. But.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm not saying everything has to go to kind of a whistleblower model, but to some extent, the way that newspapers, maintain various distributed bureaus and things like that, maybe that needs to change and become more like kind of like when a story breaks on Reddit and someone says, hey, look at this, I'm on the ground, I took these pictures, or ask me anything about this situation, I'm right here. And then people kind of in real time probe them. And it's kind of the story kind of surfaces as the story is happening.
Well, that's right. And so, I mean, we're seeing that already. And there's always, people have always talked about citizen journalism or whatever, and they kind of, some people mock that idea. But I think it is really important. And one of the interesting things about that too is that when anyone can sort of be a journalist, right, then oftentimes you can have the people who are directly involved, and so and there are certain biases to be aware of there, but you can actually get more. A more complete picture often when people who are closer to the story. If it's the person who was just walking down the street where something happens, they saw it happen. It's not somebody coming later to gather the information. I mean, there are risks there too because they can, especially in the early moments of something big.
What I was trying to get at is the fact that one of the roles of the journalist was to have sort of this high ethical standard and to surface kind of quote unquote true facts, right?
Sure.
And to not let their voice kind of pollute the story.
Right.
And I think to some extent that particular role is the thing that we can kind of do in software with crowds, right? That particular role, and that is one of the most expensive parts of journalism. And like if you look at kind of the editorial side, the opinion side of journalism, like say the John Oliver show, right? And they do a great job of kind of servicing and making like these really kind of arcane things in our society to make it more visible with humor and stuff like that. But recently, the guy actually went and interviewed Snowden himself,
right,
in Russia, right? And that was kind of a big deal. But the point is, like, if you have these guys that are doing opinion stuff and they're making enough money, they can. Instead of having bureaus that are really expensive, they can basically source stuff initially, and then when needed, kind of tactically go with the big resources, with the John Oliver, and do the on-the-ground thing when it's necessary to pursue a particular story.
I mean, and there have always been these big arguments about, like, for lots of newspapers, right? I mean, does it make sense for them to have foreign bureaus when they could have local people reporting there,
or every paper to have a foreign bureau.
Right. Does every newspaper need a Moscow bureau or something? Does every newspaper need a White House reporter?
Right.
And that's where you get things like, where they pool resources, or you get the Associated
Press. Isn't that what the AP kind of is? Or?
That was sort of the point of the AP in the early days, which is right. I mean, to sort of pool resources and be able to use the resources of one or another paper and share it back and forth. And so that gets to some of the reporting, and I don't know. I don't think there are any easier answers to this. I mean, I don't think I know how these things happen. And then I mean, there's been. Nonprofits have stepped in. ProPublica has become a really great source of reporting lately. But
yeah. I mean, it makes me wonder, like, should we take one step back and say, is journalism, are we worse off today?
Yeah, I don't think so. There are people who argue differently. I think we're, it's an amazing time that there's,
I mean, it seems like we're getting, it's not perfect by any means.
Sure.
But I think information today travels more quickly than ever. Stories that are important are being told.
Yep.
Just the
you get called out on your bullshit a lot quicker.
Yeah, and I think the old infrastructure that was in place maybe was needed before what we have today, and that's kind of what we're seeing is kind of these vestigial pieces.
Mismatched costs, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
Maybe stories are being told, and this is what it looks like when we kind of are shaking it out.
Yeah.
Is that what's happening? I don't know.
I think it could be. I mean, that's probably the argument that I would make the most. I mean, there are people who disagree, and I'm certain, and there are certainly stories that are falling through the cracks. Nobody denies that, but I agree that I think a lot of really great stories are being told, and often in really interesting ways. I mean, I think that you can do new and different things, by bringing in the original sources and letting them speak out and tell their own story. Makes for some much more interesting journalism today. The question still is, how does it get funded, if it gets funded at all? Some of it is just voluntary.
Right. And then there's the kind of echo chamber, or like that kind of argument where
there's always been an echo chamber. I don't think that's
I mean, right, it's something to pay attention to. I don't buy the argument. I mean, I think I think everyone has always argued, oh, there's an echo chamber, which usually just means, oh, there are popular news sites that I don't like.
Right.
I was just thinking, one of the kind of business models we haven't really talked about is sort of the merchandising model, right?
Sure.
Where if you have people want to be associated with a certain kind of content, just like they like a particular band. I can see a future in which, people like the serial journalists or like, I don't know, the economist for certain people, if they develop a particular brand in a particular demographic, then they can sell T-shirts and stuff. I mean, it probably sounds really terrible, but just think about how much money people make selling T-shirts and things like that.
It only sounds terrible because that's what people always used to mock. The business model suggestions that I always used to make about musicians, people would, because I would always mention T-shirts as one small aspect of a larger business model, and people are like, oh, you just think everyone should sell T-shirts, and hey, TechTurt does sell T-shirts,
right.
but
I mean, events is another business,
and
really
which we haven't touched on at all, and I think is a really big one, which is, and a lot of successful journalism publications have found events to be a huge business model, and one that keeps them in business. And so,
I mean, TED basically is, right, it's kind of a media business
absolutely is
funded by a very expensive event. Right?
Yes.
So
insanely expensive event.
How does that sort of new media empire Vice work? I see them all over the place now, all over YouTube.
I mean, they're not so new media. I mean, they've been around for a really long time, and to some extent, they are a marketing and ad agency with a journalism piece tacked on. And so,
I mean, they started off as the book you would get in American Apparel, right? So,
is that what it was?
Yeah, it was a magazine, physical book you get for free.
Yeah,
that's kind of where they cut their teeth. And I think they're doing some very interesting journalistic
They have some insane video journalism that I've seen. I mean, they have a guy like in Afghanistan. He's like with the Taliban. I'm like, who is this guy? How did they get there? I don't even see New York Times stories like this.
No,
crazy.
they've done some really great journalism. But I mean, it's interesting, and people kind of struggle with it. That they realistically started out as a marketing and an ad agency,
like journaltainment.
Yeah, and yet they've done some really serious journalism at the same time, and so you have that. It's a really interesting mix. And so people look down. I mean, Vice and BuzzFeed often get sort of lumped together as things that real traditional journalists like to mock. And yet, when you look, they've done some really impressive journalism, and, and who knows how sustainable it is, but they're valued super highly, and they've both been able to raise lots and lots of money.
And tell really interesting, impactful stories.
Yeah,
I think
incredibly
crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Like on the ground when Ukraine was being invaded, right there.
And they did, and they did a whole thing from North Korea, and like everywhere that like other reporters won't go, they've been able to go and do some amazing reporting. And so,
and they have this real punk rock feel to it, where I can just totally imagine them selling Vice T-shirts and it like selling out.
And they do. Yeah.
They do.
Yeah.
Okay.
They
haven't seen any
everything.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'll get you a T-shirt.
And so I mean, they're interesting things, but again, part of their, like both BuzzFeed and Vice have really focused on scale, right? I mean, so they've done this stuff and they've just figured out ways to scale up tremendously, and so there is still this question about whether or not you can do that without having that kind of scale. And that's certainly important to me personally, running a site that I don't think we're never going to try and scale up to the size of a BuzzFeed or a Vice.
Yeah.
But making sure
you would be okay with it.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I don't think that we should be that kind of.
Do either of you have any notion of kind of what the health is of, like, say, the Wall Street Journal or the Economist or the Economic Times? Like, I'm wondering how these very sober, very non-entertainment, very factual kind of publications are. How are they getting on? Like, are they struggling?
Yeah, I mean, most of them won't say. I mean, the Wall Street Journal is a part of, part of News Corp, so it's sort of buried in there. I think they're doing okay, and partly that's just because the Wall Street Journal is just such a tradition, right? And the same with the Economist. They're doing really well, and there was just one of the guys from there just gave this interview not too long ago in which he was talking about the success of their subscription model, which I thought. I disagreed with, and I had written an article on TechDirt sort of arguing that he was being a bit delusional, which was perhaps not fair to him.
Do you want to elaborate more on that, or does it take too long?
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of running out of time, but his argument was that the reason that people pay for The Economist was that they want this sense of, I think it was finishability, right? So he was arguing that what people don't like about the internet is the fact that there's always more. And so, when you had like an old fashioned newspaper, you could read it till the end. And so The Economist strives to be that thing that you can finish and feel like you know everything, that you've been well informed, and there you feel. And so his argument was that was that was the selling point. And my response to that was, I don't think, and people disagreed with me very vocally on this, from a lot of people disagreed with me on this, was that I don't think the younger generation today, the people who are growing up more digitally native, that they desire that same sense of finishability because they know that everything is out there. And they don't believe, if you give them, say, this is the whole story, they don't believe you, and they don't want that. They want to be able to dig deeper, and they want to be able to look up other stuff, and they want to be able to share things, and they want to be able to discuss things. And so I see, like, I definitely agree that there's an older generation, and this is not to just make it all about generations, because, whatever, but I think that the growing audience of people who are growing up today, growing up digital, that they don't care so much about that idea of finishability. And lots of people disagree with me on that.
I think in the early 2000s, that was definitely true. And when I think back, I think the guy really had something there, because I would take the Economist magazine and it would always be in my bathroom, and I would read it when I was brushing my teeth and, other activities. And that's how I would finish it. And I always finish it just in time for the next one, right? And it was a continuous cycle that way. But now I still have the Economist in my bathroom. I never open them. They just go straight into the recycling bin, and I'm always reading the stories on the iPad, and I always get them through Reddit.
Yeah.
Right? Or, Hacker News or whatever, one of these like other aggregation sites. And oftentimes the stories don't have anything to do with what was published this month. It's like from a few weeks ago. It's like a year ago. It's like they're just randomly linked in. And so I don't think he's right about that. And I'm certainly not a young digital native spring chicken, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm older.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know. People were vehemently disagreeing with me on that. So there are some people who really do value finishability. I just don't know generationally if it'll stick or not.
I think for my dad, that's true. I mean, he reads the magazines.
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously the age of getting all of your news from the evening newscast is kind of past. That said, I find myself feeling kind of frantic trying to accumulate the full story about I can't read any news story now without essentially digging myself into a rat hole.
But I like that.
No, I love it.
Depends
but
how much time you have. It's your job. We got other
Yeah,
jobs to do.
I
Mike.
guess that's true.
which is and I think I was describing this process to my mom where I think she was like, if I read this article, I was like, well, did you dig deeper? And I explained to her what happens in terms of you Googling it and trying to find the other side of a story, and she said, she says, that sounds exhausting. And I was like, yeah, it is. But that's kind of the state. It's great that we have like. Imagine, 50 years ago when you only had the newspaper, where else are you going to go for opposite opinions and different viewpoints and whatnot? And that's kind of where we are. And if we as a society are kind of educating everyone to dig deeper, that seems like a better thing.
And so I know we've gone way over the amount of time that we normally do. So I'm gonna
and off topic
and somewhat off topic, but I'm gonna bring it back around and give a final thought, and then you guys can chime in, and then we're gonna close it out. But that leads me to an interesting thought, which is, and I've seen this suggested a few times. I think I wrote about it on TechTirt. I can't even remember at this point, but I once this idea that before when you did just have newspapers and you wanted to dig deeper, what did you do? What you actually did was you went to the local pub or the local coffee shop and you discussed it with people, and there was a community that was built around people who would, sit around and discuss stuff.
Right.
And to some extent, that is what like social media has become, and Twitter and Facebook, where you or Reddit and Hacker News and things like that, where people gather and discuss the news. And so it's not all about, it's not all about the solitary pursuit of the other side of the story, but the discussion that happens after. And that gets back to the point that I made at the beginning about building the community, right? And so where you can build a community that is actually interested in these things and they stick around to discuss it, I think that's really interesting. And I still think that that's where the business models have to focus on. How do you continue to build that community, and how do you
I think that leads to the question is, once you have a community, how do you make money from that? What is your business?
Yeah. We've already gone over time,
and I think that to me is the question. It's like, now that we've aggregated a community,
right?
What's the business? So
maybe
I'm leaving with an open-ended question.
I think we are. But Hirsch, any final thoughts from you, or
no?
You've said your piece on this. All right. Well, this is an interesting discussion. I'm sure we will touch on this topic again, because it's one where there aren't any easy answers, and it's one that personally I have to struggle with, just to keep in business. So
go buy a Tech Dirt t-shirt today.
Yeah, please go buy a Tech Dirt t-shirt. All right. Thanks again, everyone who's listening, and Hirsch and Dennis, thanks for joining me, and we'll be back next week.
The truth will set you free. Should we listen to the whistleblowers? Of course. Even if it'll throw us? Of course. Because if you need to suppress the truth, then I expect that you've got some regretful news. But it's best that you confess, and soon, before we end up less than destitute. Civilian deaths and executions are routine, while billions are spent on weapon producing. Do you think you can reduce the terror threat